There was bread on the table every Sunday after service. Not the kind you buy, the kind that takes a morning to make. The kind where you can still feel the warmth through the cloth when you carry it from the kitchen. There were long wooden tables pushed together in a living room with the furniture moved to the walls. There were pickled beets in glass jars catching the afternoon light. There were women moving through the kitchen like water, passing plates, lifting pies from countertops, their voices soft and braided together beneath the sound of children running barefoot between their father's legs. The men stood outside in their black vests and their satisfaction, hands in their suspenders, nodding at one another the way men nod when they have just been told by God that they are good. The hymns were still in the walls. You could feel them in the wood, and there was peace. The deep, slow, golden kind of peace that makes you believe everything you are looking at is true. Everything I just described is real. I have carried that bread. I have heard those hymns settle into the wood of a farmhouse on a July afternoon. And every single Sunday, after the last plate was washed and the last buggy disappeared down the lane, my husband did something inside our home that none of those beautiful people around that table would ever name out loud. He did it for 7 years. Every Sunday. And the next week, I set the table again. I have shown you the table. I have shown you what you would have seen if you drove past on a Sunday afternoon in Lancaster County. And it is beautiful. I am not telling you it is not beautiful. But there is more behind that picture than bread and hymns and sunlight. And I need to show you what happens when the buggies leave. If this is the kind of story you come here for, the kind that lives behind the frame, then stay with me. Subscribe if you have not. Every woman who joins this channel is choosing to look at the whole picture instead of just the part they were allowed to see. And if you already know what a Sunday silence feels like, if you have sat inside your own version of that buggy, that car, that quiet living room, tell me in the comments. You do not need to name anyone. Just tell me what your silence sounded like. There is a myth about the Amish Sunday table that I need you to understand before I can tell you anything else. The myth is not a lie. That is what makes it so powerful. The myth is this, that when an Amish community gathers after church, what you are witnessing is the full truth of who these people are. The long tables, the abundance, the women serving with quiet grace, the men bowing their heads before the meal, their hands rough from the week's work, their prayers low and sincere. The children sitting still in a row, smallest to tallest, waiting their turn. The shoe-fly pie on the counter. The Amish peanut butter spread, the sweet kind, the one made with marshmallow cream, that tourists buy at roadside stands but have never tasted the way it tastes when it is passed to you by a woman who made it at 5 a.m. because she could not sleep. The myth says this is a community that loves each other, that shares, that holds each other close. And if you are standing at the table, looking at the bread and the light and the bowed heads, the myth is the only thing you can see. That is what you see if you are standing at the table. Now let me tell you what you hear if you are standing at the sink. The sink is where the women are. Behind the table, behind the men, behind the performance of fellowship, there is a kitchen. And in that kitchen, there are hands in water. The women do not sit at the table at the same time as the men. That is not how it works. The men eat first. The women serve. And then the women stand together at the counter and the sink, and they eat what is left, standing, quickly, while their hands keep moving. And they talk. But not the way the myth says they talk. They do not talk about blessings. They talk in code. One woman mentions her husband's mood this morning, the way he held the reins on the way to church, the way he looked at her when their daughter dropped a hymnal. Another woman changes the subject. She changes it one beat too fast. And there is a woman at the end of the counter in a long-sleeved dress in the middle of July, and the sleeves are not about modesty. Nobody looks at her arms. Nobody asks. There is a specific kind of silence that happens between women who all know the same thing and have all agreed, without ever speaking the agreement aloud, to never say it. That silence lives at the sink. It is louder than the laughter at the table. It is the sound of women who know exactly what the picture costs because they are the ones paying for it. The Sunday table is real. The bread is real. The fellowship is real for the men. For the women, the Sunday table is a shift. It is hours of labor dressed as devotion, service dressed as joy, silence dressed as grace. And the most sacred part of it, the part the myth insists upon, is that you must look content while you do it. You must move through the kitchen as though there is nowhere else you would rather be. You must pass the plates with hands that do not tremble. You must not look at the woman in the long sleeves. You must not ask. The table is beautiful. The sink is true. And the distance between the two is where the myth lives. After the table was cleared and the families began to leave, we would walk outside to the buggy. My husband would hitch the horse while I gathered the children, and from the road, from the outside, what you would see is the most peaceful image the Amish world has ever produced. A family in a buggy on a country lane. The father at the reins, the mother beside him, the children in the back, drowsy from the meal, their heads against the quilts folded behind the bench seat. The horse knows the way home. The fields stretch out on either side like God is showing you the quilt he made. And the tourists slow down. They take photographs. They point at us and say to each other, "Look at that. Look at that peace, that simplicity. That is how life is supposed to be." I know they say this because I could see their mouths moving through the windows of their cars. They were narrating our peace while they drove past it at 40 miles an hour. You hear the horse. You see the quilt. You imagine the peace. But you cannot hear what I heard. The sound inside that buggy was not the clip of hooves on asphalt. It was silence. And I need you to understand that there are different kinds of silence in a marriage. There is the silence of two people who are comfortable enough to be quiet together. There is the silence of two people who have run out of things to say. And then there is the silence that has a temperature. Ours was the third kind. It was cold. It was cold even in August, when the sweat ran down my back beneath my dress, and the children's faces were flushed from the heat. That silence was cold because it was not empty. It was full. It was full of what was coming. I learned to read that silence the way you learn to read weather, when your living depends on the harvest. If his jaw was set and his hands were tight on the reins, the evening would go one direction. If his shoulders were dropped and his breathing was steady, the evening might pass quietly. If he looked at me, if he turned his head and looked at me even once during those 15 minutes, then something I had done at the table had been wrong. I would spend the rest of the ride trying to remember what it was. Did I laugh too loudly? Did I speak too long with another woman's husband nearby? Did the children fidget during the sermon? I would inventory every moment of the morning, searching for the infraction, while the fields rolled past and the tourists photographed our peace. The children learned it too. They did not fall asleep against the quilts. They went still. Not the stillness of rest. The stillness of children who have learned that being small means being safe, that making no sound means drawing no attention, that the quieter they are, the more likely the evening will pass without incident. 15 minutes. That is how long the ride was. In 7 years of Sundays, that is roughly 91 hours. 91 hours of sitting beside a man I was married to in the eyes of God and the community, reading his jaw, reading his hands, reading the angle of his silence, calculating what the next 6 hours of my life would feel like. And from the road, every single time, it looked like peace. It looked like a painting. It looked like the life people leave the city to dream about. That is the distance between a myth and a truth. You can photograph a myth from a passing car. You have to live inside the truth. And no one photographs the inside. The buggy stopped. He climbed down first. He always climbed down first. He did not offer his hand to help me step out. That was a courtship gesture. and courtship was a performance that had ended the day after the wedding. I gathered the children. I carried the youngest on my hip and held the middle one's hand and told the oldest to take his shoes off before he went inside. I did all of this without instruction, because the instructions had been given years ago and did not need repeating. A good wife does not need to be told twice. A good wife does not need to be told at all. She learns the shape of what is expected, and she fills it the way water fills a jar, completely, without resistance, without sound. The community has a myth about what an Amish husband does on a Sunday afternoon. It is a gentle myth, a warm one. The myth says, he rests. He has earned it. He rose before dawn 6 days this week. He fed the animals, he plowed, he built, he repaired. He led his family to church. He prayed with his head bowed and his hat over his heart. He sat through the 3-hour service without complaint. He shook hands with the bishop. He ate the bread his wife baked. And now, on Sunday afternoon, he rests. The myth shows him on the porch with a glass of water and the scripture open on his knee, the late sun on his face, his youngest child climbing into his lap, his dog at his feet. The myth says, this is a man who leads with quiet strength, a man whose authority is earned through devotion, a man whose household is at peace because he is at peace. The community believes this. The bishop believes this. The tourists driving past believe this most of all. They see the porch and the man and the Bible, and they believe they are looking at something solid and true and good. That is the man the community sees walk through the church door. Let me tell you about the man who walked through our front door. The front door had a latch, not a lock. Amish homes do not lock their doors because who would you be locking out? We are all family here, but that latch made a sound when it closed. A small metal sound, a click. And over 7 years, that click became the loudest sound in my week. Not because it was loud, because of what it meant. It meant the performance was over. It meant the Sunday shirt could come off. It meant whatever he had been holding inside himself through 4 hours of church and 2 hours of fellowship, the irritation, the grievance, the authority that had been patiently waiting for privacy, was now going to fill the house. The temperature of our home changed when that latch clicked. I do not mean this as a metaphor. I mean the air in the room got heavier. The children felt it. The dog felt it. Even the light seemed to pull back from the windows, as though the house itself knew what Sunday afternoon meant. He would sit in his chair. The chair faced the window, but he did not look outside. He looked inward, and the silence he brought into that chair was not the silence of rest. It was the silence of a man preparing to correct. Sunday was correction day. Not every Sunday the same correction, and that would have been easier because I could have prepared. Some Sundays it was my conversation at the table. I had spoken too freely. I had laughed in a way that drew attention. I had stood too close to a window where a man outside could see my face. Some Sundays it was the children. The youngest had cried during a hymn. The oldest had looked at an English car with too much curiosity. Some Sundays, the worst Sundays, it was nothing. Nothing I could identify. Nothing I could trace back to a moment or a word or a gesture. He simply sat in his chair, and the house went cold, and I spent the afternoon moving through rooms like a woman walking through a frozen pond, testing every step, waiting for the crack. He did not yell. I want to be clear about this because the myth of the abusive husband is a yelling man, a violent man, a man whose cruelty is visible from the road. My husband's cruelty was never visible from the road. It was barely visible from across the room. He spoke quietly. He always spoke quietly. The corrections came in the voice of a man reading scripture, measured, certain, calm. He would tell me what I had done wrong. He would tell me what God expected of a wife. He would reference the sermon from that morning, the very sermon we had both just sat through, and he would use it. The pastor's words became his tools. The scripture became his authority. He did not need to raise his voice, because God's voice was already raised, and he was simply the messenger. That is what spiritual authority looks like when it closes the front door. It does not shout. it quotes. And quoting is quieter than shouting, and it is harder to argue with, and it leaves no bruise that anyone can see. The community has another myth, and it is about me. It is about the Amish wife on a Sunday. The myth says she is content. She is a helpmate. She is the soft ground the household stands on. She serves not because she must, but because she wants to. Because serving is her calling, her design, her joy. She wears the prayer covering with the dignity of a woman who knows exactly who she is and exactly where she belongs. She does not want more. She does not need more. She has God and her husband and her children and her kitchen and her garden. And these things fill her the way Sunday fills the week, completely, with no room left for doubt. The myth calls her a vessel, filled with purpose, filled with grace. A beautiful, quiet, steady vessel. A vessel. Yes, I was a vessel, but not the kind they meant. A vessel is something you pour into until it is full. I was the kind you pour out of until there is nothing left. And every Sunday, he poured. Sunday evening was the heaviest hour of my week. After the correction, after the silence, after the children were in bed and the house was dark except for the lamp in the kitchen, that is when the real Sunday began. The Sunday behind the Sunday. The one no one photographs. The one the bishop does not ask about. I cannot give you one Sunday because they were all the same Sunday. That is what 7 years does to time. It collapses it. 7 years of the same cycle. The church, the table, the buggy, the latch, the chair, the correction, the silence, the evening, the demand, the Monday. And then Saturday night again, standing at the ironing board, pressing his white Sunday shirt for the next performance. The iron was heavy, not metaphorically. It was a heavy iron. And the shirt had to be perfect, no crease out of place, no wrinkle, no imperfection. Because that shirt was the first thing the community saw when he stood up in the pew. That shirt said, his wife takes care of him, his household is in order, his authority is producing a righteous home. I pressed 7 years of righteousness into that shirt. I pressed it every Saturday night while the children slept and the house was quiet, and my hands moved the iron back and forth across the white cotton, like a woman sweeping the same floor that will only get dirty again tomorrow. I pressed the performance flat. I made it smooth. I made it presentable. And every Sunday evening, he took it off and dropped it on the bedroom floor, and I picked it up and put it in the wash and waited for Saturday to come again so I could press it again. The shirt was our marriage made into fabric, beautiful from the pew, wrinkled on the floor. And I was the one who had to make it beautiful again, every single week, without anyone ever asking me if my arms were tired. There was a woman. I will not say her name. She sat beside me one afternoon during a canning circle. Late summer, the kitchen full of steam, jars lined up on the counter like glass soldiers. We were sealing lids. Our hands were busy. And when your hands are busy, sometimes your mouth says what your mind has been holding. She looked at me over the jar lids, and she said, without turning her head all the way, so that only I could hear, we are all just pressing the same shirt, every single week. And if one of us stops pressing, the whole picture wrinkles. So none of us stop. Then she sealed her jar. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the woman across the kitchen and smiled. The smile was perfect. The smile was pressed flat. She went right back into the myth, right there, in the same breath she had named it. That is the part I cannot